Hello, everyone. My name is Professor Mirjana Pantic. This is MCA 1015 News Reporting. Today, we're going to talk about different types of news stories. Let me share my screen with you and let me introduce you to Brights, Follow-ups, Roundups, Sidebars, and Obituaries. Let's start, let's start with the first type of a news story that you're likely to encounter in newspapers. They're called brights. What are brights? They're short humor stories that often have surprise endings. What kind of format do they usually utilize? Some brights tend to follow the inverted pyramid format, that writing style, where the most important information is placed at the beginning of the story. Some other brights have a different type of style, and they opt for unexpected twists instead. Brides that have surprise endings are called suspended interest stories. Now, let me just show you two examples so you can differentiate between brides that utilize what we call the inverted pyramid style and brides that utilize suspended interest style, as you can see in version number 2. This is basically the same story, just has two different versions. Version 1, both stories are about two men. The event was two men decided to rob the owner of a local pizzeria. But what happened is that bag they took from him didn't contain any money, which is what they expected, but it contained 5 pounds of pizza dough. So let's take a look at both versions. So now that I told you everything, this suspended interest story is no longer interested. And that's the whole point of a bride, of the bride. Version 1. Two armed men robbed the owner of a local pizzeria at gunpoint Tuesday night and took off with the bag full of dough, pizza dough. Police Chief Barry Copperwood said Wednesday morning. So, as you can see from the lead of the story, you know right away that these two men basically robbed somebody else looking for the money, but instead they took a bag full of pizza dough. Two men have been arrested in connection with the crime. Frederick C. Taylor, 25, of 4828 North Wine Street, and Grady Smith, 22, of 8213 Peach Street. The robbers, both of whom wore masks, confronted White Show, the manager of Giovanni's Pizza Parlor on North Wisconsin Avenue, as he was leaving the store shortly after 11:30. So basically, in the rest of the story, they added more details. As you know, the inverted pyramid format goes starts with the most important information, ends with the least important information. This is not the end of the story. I just decided to cut it there. And the version 2, I didn't want to also like provide the full story. The full story you can find in the textbook, but the version 2 starts in a different way. You will find out at the end what actually happened. But both of them represent brides, so they're humorous stories, just that they use different styles. In case of the inverted pyramid, you will find out what happened at the beginning, but when it comes to suspended interest, you will need to wait until the end to see what really happened. So you're being kept like, excited about like learning what's going to happen at the end. So in excited or tense, I guess. Police arrested two men shortly before midnight Tuesday on suspicion of robbing the manager of a local pizza parlor at gunpoint. So the gun is involved, and that is why people are likely to continue reading the story, even though they will learn at the end what really happened. The two in custody are Frederick C. Taylor and Grady Smith, blah, blah. And then there were a couple of paragraphs explaining, providing more details about the event. And at the end of the story, you will find what exactly happened. When police opened the bag, it was found to contain exactly what Cho said had been stolen from him, 5 pounds of pizza dough. Cho had been taking the dough to the Giovanni's Pizza Parlor on Hazel Street. He told police the robbers must have thought the bag contained the evening receipts. Now, so these are basically brides. They're now clear to you. You just can use them to portray bizarre, unusual, funny, humorous events. Follow-ups, they are reports on new developments. They basically represent stories that add new details to something that has already happened. So let's say stories that were reported earlier, like the day before, 2 days ago, or a few days ago, or maybe a year ago, and there's like a follow-up, you will create a completely new report starting with the most relevant information, with something that just happened in connection to the original story. If we think about an example of, let's say, that we mentioned when we were talking about broadcast broadcast journalism. Let's say a Nashville woman um, escaped from. She didn't escape from prison, but let's say police are looking for a Nashville woman after escaped. She escaped after being charged of battery and assault, and that would be your original story. So you're reporting that the police are looking for a Nashville woman who was charged for assault and battery. And then your follow-up story will be, let's say, if they arrested her a couple of days later, then your follow-up will be a Nashville woman who escaped after being charged for assault and battery was arrested this morning, blah, blah. So that is your follow-up story. So but you're not going to start with that previous lead that was that she escaped. You will start with what just happened. So she got arrested. That is now the most important. The most important thing is we already know that she escaped, but the most important thing now is that she got arrested. They're also called secondary or developing stories. They're tied to a past event. So there is an original event that happened and based on which we are creating these follow-up stories. But the lead of a follow-up story emphasizes the latest developments. So examples include trials after crimes, political affairs, reports after natural disasters, and so on. One such example is also on January 1st. You remember how I talk about January 1st because I was recording my video lectures in January. So on January 1st, there was and actually I mentioned that in one of my lectures. There was a terrorist attack in New Orleans, and there was another tragedy that happened in Las Vegas when this cyber truck exploded in front of Donald Trump's hotel in Vegas. And we didn't know who was the person who drove the car. So it wasn't reported on January 1st. It was reported on January 2nd or January 3rd, I believe, when they collected more information about him. So identifying the person who did it is actually a follow-up story, because the original story published on January 1st was with the cyber truck exploded basically in front of Donald Trump's hotel in Las Vegas, killing one person and injuring several others. So that was the original story. But then when you find more details, such as the motive or the person who did it, then your story the next day becomes a follow-up story, but it has a completely new lead. This is the person who did it, and so on. Now, roundups. I think that follow-ups are basically very simple, very clear. Just remember, do not repeat that information. Do not repeat the lead that you had in your story the day before, but start with the new information. What is new? related to that story. Roundups, they're used for saving space and time. How are they used? So instead of writing several stories, news organizations summarize several different but related events in roundup stories. Remember that when we discussed broadcast journalism, we talked about umbrella leads. So this is basically um, that. So there are multiple stories happening related to the same event. So you sum them up in the lead of the story, and then you discuss details about each story in the body of the story. An example, instead of publishing separate stories about each traffic death that occurs in a given weekend, newspapers and broadcast media often summarize several fatal incidents in a single story. And remember those people who died when it was cold, and instead of like creating separate stories for that woman who was 82 and the other man who also died, we talked about this when I covered broadcast journalism. So instead of like creating separate stories, they had one lead and then they described each tragedy in that same story. So that is basically what roundups are about. And I want to give you one example. This is, so don't worry, this was also January 1st, 2025. So the winter is over. Um, Reporting on weather conditions in multiple states. For example, this was published by NBC. Much of the US bracing for a big blast of winter and serious cold. And then the lead basically covers several states in on the East Coast. A blast of Arctic air will send temperatures dropping across the eastern United States this week. So they didn't pick one state and focus on that, but instead they grouped them. And then in the story, I just selected three paragraphs. The story is much longer. So they grouped them all into the lead. They have this umbrella lead, and then they discussed different areas of the East Coast, different states, and how what kind of weather conditions they should expect. We are going to be stuck in a cooler pattern, said Zachary Yak, a National Weather Service meteorologist based in Chicago. It will definitely go into the middle and early part of next week. The Arctic outbreak has already sent temperatures tumbling in the northern plain states. Forecasters predict Minneapolis high temperature would be 20 degrees Fahrenheit on Thursday and drop to 12 degrees Saturday. So you see, they grouped these states into one lead and they talked about individual cities, Chicago, Minneapolis, and so on. Now, let's take a look at sidebars and how are they different from other types of stories that we just covered, from roundups and brights and fallout. So sidebars are basically separate stories within the story that describe developments related to a major event. So if we look at, they usually give readers additional information about the topic. So if we look at the story, this is the main story that you see. I could have lost my baby girl. It is about that tragic mass shooting in Uvalde, Texas. And in the story, um, there is a main story. And then I'm sorry, I always, when I think about that event, it's impossible to remain calm and rational when you think about what happened. I could have lost my baby girl, so that's the main story. And then within that story, there is like a smaller separate story that is connected to Uvalde shooting, but it's kind of created on the side of the major story. So we have basically in this one big story, we have two stories from Uvalde, but the main story is I could have lost my carries this title, I could have lost my baby girl, and then there is a smaller story in in inside the bigger one. So that is basically a sidebar. I'm not saying it's smaller as less relevant, but you can see also different types of sidebars. But let me just finish this one first. In addition to the main story about parents whose children were victims of the shooting at an elementary school in Uvalde, Texas, testifying before Congress, the San Antonio Express News of June 9th, 2022 ran a front page sidebar on the funeral for one of the children who died in the shooting. So the main story was about the parents who lost children, whose children were victims, and then they also added a story of a funeral. There are other things that you can also see in sidebars. So one example is when there is a big story about the state of US and economy, for example, and then you can see one or maybe even two sidebars portraying specific numbers. Those numbers could refer to employment rates, or they could refer to inflation rates, mortgage rates, whatever. So you can have sidebars basically that are connected to the main story, the state of our economy, but there are sidebars that portray specific things. And sometimes it's better actually to place information in sidebars because people people like when something is framed in a way that emphasizes the story, or people like to focus more on certain aspects of a story. And that's why it's great to have sidebars. Now, obituaries. When do we write them? You've heard about obituaries, but it's not the same as an obituary written and published, paid by a family member. It is not the same as an obituary written by a journalist. So in journalism, you for family members, for friends, we usually, when we write an obituary, we need to pay them to be published. But journalists, and we can write and publish an obituary for anyone. But when it comes to journalism, they select who they're going to write an obituary for. It has to be a prominent individual or somebody who has contributed to the community in a way that needs to be remembered. So, prominent individuals, politicians, historical figures, and so on. Obituaries are written after people die. The death of a person is a significant event, and that is why journalists write about it. While local newspapers used to write stories about local residents who died, major newspaper would publish only obituaries about prominent individuals. So local newspapers used to publish obituaries about all the local residents, but when it comes to bigger major newspapers, they focus on prominent individuals. And I'm going to mention former President Jimmy Carter again. I know I was recording these lectures at the time when he passed away, but he's definitely he's definitely going to be a remembered president. And he was also the longest, I believe that I actually, instead of like saying these things, I'm just going to read the obituary because I'm not I'm instead of like recalling information from my memory, I'm just gonna read the obituary. I mean, President Jimmy Carter lived 100 years. So, and that's, I think, another intriguing and interesting information about him. Jimmy Carter, I mean, what I'm saying is that all these information contribute to the story in a way that they make the story interesting to read. Jimmy Carter, peacemaking president amid crisis, is that at 100. And Jimmy Carter, who rose from Georgia farmland to become the 39th president of the United States on a promise of national healing after the wounds of Watergate and Vietnam, then lost the White House in a cauldron of economic turmoil at home and crisis in Iran, died on Sunday at his home in Plains, Georgia. He was 100. So, in the first paragraph or in the lead of the story, the New York Times described who Jimmy Carter was. They used the most important information about him, and then at the end, they stated his age. It is important to state the age of a person when they die. In some other cases, as I mentioned, like mentioning the age is not relevant, but when it comes to a person's death, then we need to have that information in the lead of the story. The Carter Center in Atlanta announced his death, which came nearly 3 months after Mr. Carter, already the longest living president in American history, became the first former commander-in-chief to reach the century mark. Mr. Carter went into hospice care 22 months ago, but endured longer than even his family expected. So actually, this is what I got confused while talking about Jimmy Carter and trying to recall certain information about him. This is actually what I wanted to mention, that he was the longest living president in American history. And tributes poured in from presidents, world leaders, and many everyday people from around the world who admired not only Mr. Carter's service during 4 years in the White House, but his 4 decades of efforts since leaving office to fight disease, broker peace, and provide for the poor, and so on. So you see, like, these are some of the most important information that you need to have in an obituary. And I'll give you some details what else you should have. If you want to read the entire story you can go to the New York Times and search for this story about Jimmy Carter that was published at the end of December 29th, 2024, when he died. What is it that we need to include in an obituary? In case of celebrity, stating the cause of that is important. Was it necessary in this case? He was 100 years old, so it was evident that he was in hospice care, so he was old and he died. In some other cases, we also mentioned one of the lectures, you remember, we were talking about leads, and we mentioned Liam Payne and a follow-up story. So now that I mentioned a follow-up story is actually in case of Liam Payne is, first of all, it's the cause of his death. So that's something that is going to be determined later. So that's a follow-up story. And also the people who gave him drugs who were later in Argentina, who were later arrested, that's another follow-up story. The original story is that Liam Payne died. And in case of celebrity, in that case, it is important to state his age, but also cause of that is really important. Gather information from grieving friends and family members, add that to the story. A lot of people now tend to publish their messages, condolences on social media. So you also need to search for such information on Instagram and Twitter. Write about the person's accomplishments, and you see how the New York Times basically emphasized his accomplishments in the second, third paragraph. List the time and place of the funeral and memorial service. This is also important because if people are interested in going, then you need to provide that information to them. Now, at the end of this brief lecture about several different types of news stories, I want you to do the following. My brides, I'm not sure that you're going to write them that often. Obituaries, you usually write them when a person dies, so it's not that you're going to write about somebody every day, but what you're going to write about for sure, what is really important is understanding in which cases you're going to need to write a follow-up story. So we will practice writing follow-up stories in class, but what I want you to do before class, and this is the exercise that you need to submit before class, under developing story in the discussion, find 2 news stories published in the media since our last meeting, summarize them briefly, provide links, and explain if you believe the stories deserve a follow-up. So find any 2 news stories and just explain if these stories deserve a follow-up. If they do, what is it that the follow-up story should cover? Which new details should be included? For both stories, just make sure to please include the links to stories so I can check them, and write about 350 words total, 350 words. Now let's go just through the lecture one more time, and let's go through the main points of the lecture. What are brights? Brights are short humorous stories. We usually use them to cover bizarre events. Follow-ups represent developing stories, so we use them when we have something more to say about the story. Roundups summarize several different but related events into one story. Obituaries are stories written when people die. So I hope this lecture was interesting and clear to you. Thank you very much for listening. I'm going to see you soon, and we'll practice writing more follow-ups in class. Have a nice day. Bye.